Paragraphs 333 and 334 of Jung's Psychology and Alchemy launch this paper on its course. Jung writes, 4 stages of the alchemical opus are distinguished, 4, characterized by the original colors mentioned in Heraclitus: melanosis, blackening; leucosis, whitening; xanthosis, yellowing; and iosis, reddening. Later, Jung goes on to say, about the 15th or 16th century, the colors were reduced to 3, and the xanthosis, otherwise called the citrinitas, gradually fell into disuse, or was but seldom mentioned. There were only 3 colors: black, white, and red. The first main goal of the process, still Jung, highly prized by many alchemists, is the silver or moon condition, which has still to be raised to the sun condition. The albedo, whitening, is, so to speak, the daybreak, but not till the rubedo is it sunrise. Not till the rubedo is it sunrise. The transition to the rubedo is formed by the yellowing. The transition to the rubedo is formed by the yellowing, though this, as we have said, was omitted later. Now, the questions arising from Jung's statements, which we'll try to deal with, are these. What is the nature of the omitted yellow? What are the specific consequences of this omission, beyond the evident and ominous reversion from a 4-fold system to a 3-fold system? Since the color yellow continues to appear in the material of contemporary alchemy, that is, analytical work, as an opus of imaginative sophistication, can analytical work shed light on the nature of yellow? And fourth, can a more precise understanding of the alchemical yellowing shed light on our analytical practices? Now, owing to the supposed development of the alchemical craft from handworkers' arts of metallurgy, embalming, and cloth dyeing, the alchemical mind perceived changes in color to be changes of essential nature. A bit of iron changes color when fired and when cooling. Red iron is malleable, black iron rigid. A cotton cloth dipped in blue tint irreversibly alters its plain white state. Dyeing, as bathing or dipping, the Greek word is baptizine, zein, affects essence. Dyeing, changing color, affects essence. The unbleached muslin, now colored blue, has been baptized, its soul has been changed. A proposition that change of color reveals change of essence, of course, conflicts with our usual view of colors, derived from Newton, Locke, Berkeley, and Kant, who considered colors not inherent in things, but only secondary qualities residing in our subjective eyesight. Yet, despite Western philosophy, the proposition affects the way we live in the world. As a fruit sweetens on the stem, its color changes. As a patient sickens, we see pallor, jaundiced skin, cyanotic lips, brown urine, empurpled nose, raspberry tongue, red rashes, white exudates, black stools. The human eye can distinguish 20,000 varieties of hue, helping us read the inherent intelligibility of the world. Yellow signifies a particular kind of change, usually for the worse. Withering leaves, aging pages, long stored linen, old teeth and toenails. The process of time shows as a yellowing. The alchemists spoke of it as putrefaction and corruption. English and American common speech continues to use yellow in a manner that is, as the dictionary says, often disparaging. Cowardice is yellow-bellied, so is jealousy. A yellow dog is craven, and a canary informs on his friends. The yellow star pinned on Jews reflects the jaundiced eye of prejudice. The yellow flag of quarantine is the international sign for dangerously contagious disease. Spanish amarillo relates with the bitterness of bile, and the Hebrew yerek derives from yarak, to spit. Yet there are a host of cheerfully sunny implications of yellow, from the etymological link of yellow with yolk to the metaphorical association with ripening grains, spring flowers, honey, and sunlight. The German gelb and the Latin galbus, galbinus, derive from roots meaning radiant and shining like gold. As well, the most luminous of all hues, that is, the least saturated, most luminous of all colors, is yellow. And the yellow spot in the middle of the retina is where vision is most acute. Now, this strange contrast means that it would be easy to neglect Freud's insight into the contrary meanings concurrently inherent in the basic terms of language. And instead, we would tend to look at yellow via Jung's lens of opposites. Then we would oppose yellow with purple, as in our kindergarten color wheels, or with blue, as did Goethe, or with green, as Jung did himself in opposing yellow intuition with green sensation. But definition by opposition restricts the meaning of a phenomenon to that face to which it is opposed. And then, if purple is mysterious, then yellow must be crass and blatant. If green is growth and concrete nature, then yellow must be mental and loftily abstract. If blue is cold, withdrawn, deep, and sober, then yellow must be hot, active, shallow, and crazy. The opinion that yellow is crazy floats through the literature. It was Edgar Allan Poe's supposed favorite color, as Van Gogh's, leading Havelock Ellis and Faber Buren in their comments to say such things as, quote, "Yellow frequently appeals to troubled minds." Kandinsky wrote, "Yellow may be paralleled in human nature with madness, with violent, raving lunacy." You see, the lens of opposites tends to ignore the actual context in which a yellow appears, the precision of the hue, of the color, and the words that describe it, whether it's butter or primrose or sulfur or chrome or cadmium or mustard, etc. So it is not easy to become clear regarding even this, the clearest of all colors. The most we gain by imagining in terms of opposites is seeing clearly a divine, gold-like, incorruptible yellow on the one hand, and on the other corruption and decay. We're on page 5. Therefore, to draw a first conclusion, neither by translating yellow into a symbolic meaning, nor by dividing it into positive and negative poles, will we be able to uncover its significance for an alchemical psychology. We shall have to find answers to our questions at the beginning within the context of alchemical relations, in which yellow appears as a specific transitional quality in a process. So now we have to look at sulfur, because that's where the yellowing begins to appear. In the oft-quoted passage from Mary the Jewess, to whom is attributed one of the earliest alchemical formulations of the transitions in the process, we find this sentence: "When one yellows, 3 become 4, for one yellows with yellow sulfur." When one yellows, 3 become 4, for one yellows with yellow sulfur. Albertus Magnus says, "The yellow color in metals is caused by the sulfur which colors them." Now, another name for sulfur was holy water, because it was able to vivify and bring change. These changes are intensely sensate. When raw sulfur is heated with lime, there results in a calcium sulfide, which when added to water results in gas, hydrogen sulfide. Hydrogen sulfide, or spirit of sulfur, stinks. By introducing this gas into solutions of a variety of metals, various colors appear, as they also do on the surface of the metals. The alchemical mind regards these changes, perceived by the nose and the eye, as evidence of the dictum, by means of rot, essential change takes place. By means of rot, essential change takes place. Sulfur hastens nature toward its decay and thus toward its next season. So when things stink, when they yellow with decay, something important is going on, and what is going on is sulfuric. Since the texts so often warn that the sulfur of which they speak is a sophic material and not your ordinary sulfur, we need to translate the term sophic into metaphoric or psychic. We're therefore speaking of psychic changes which appear as something going wrong, and going wrong in very particular ways, two particular ways. First, when things corrupt, rot, decay. Second, when they become physically hyperactive, because sulfur is defined as the principle of combustibility, the principle of tumult, the principle in alchemy, as Jung says, and this is a quote from Jung, which hinders perfection in all its works. Sulfur hinders perfection in all its works. Sophic best translates as not natural. Sulfur mediated by Sophia. Sulfur sophisticated by an imagination and craft of anima. Sulfur as having an aesthetic and reflective interiority beyond its crude appearance as hyperactivity and corruption. Sendivogius, an alchemist, gives a hint of this hidden potential within sulfur in a parable of sulfur wounded by salt. And when sulfur is wounded, it bleeds a pure milk-white water. Now, within my hot greed for the fatness of life, my desirous reach into the world, what analysis long condemns as manic defense, projective identification, and acting out. At last you've heard a psychological word. There lies an anima, a soul significance. Sensationalism, consumerism, and compulsions then would have another than the common or vulgar significance. Sulfuric desire contains an interior intention, and this intention disguises itself in the vivid object of desire. But sulfur's inherent desire is its own heat, its own leonine heat, that earthy feculence, again using Jung's language, earthy feculence, without which the work has no life and the stone cannot redden. When things go wrong as rot, then we're talking about the yellowing and the sulfur. My job stinks, my marriage stinks, this analysis stinks, I stink. This stench signifies sulfur making changes. These changes, however, do not have to appear as the result of a process, as a kind of reflective, clearer consciousness afterwards. No, the feeling of rot, of putrefaction, is already the awareness. The feeling of bad and wrong is already sulfur experiencing its own wound. To say it again, combustion and decay are the two ways sulfur sophisticates. Sulfur becomes aware of itself violently. Hence, some alchemists said sulfur could not be worked with until it had first been dried, that is, had been dried of its moisture, calcined, or abstracted from its propensity for emotional attachments. They were afraid of its eruptive inflammability, And we too are afraid. Most of us still enchanted by Anna Freud's dictum that the patient who acts out or the patient who is in love cannot be analyzed. Most of us afraid of an analysis going wrong and beginning to stink. Jung devotes a chapter to sulfur in the Mysterium Conjunctionis, not many pages, but wondrously condensed. He considers sulfur to be the active principle in the work and the active principle of human life. He equates sulfur with what psychology calls the motive factor. On the one hand, the conscious will, on the other, unconscious compulsion. The extreme language to which alchemy resorts to describe sulfur indicates to Jung that sulfur has affinities with the devil as corrupter and with Christ as giver of warmth and life. In either direction, devil or Christ, sulfur is usually imagined as male, hot, and of an obdurate earthly body, fat and oily, desirous as a dragon or lion. Though it is the urgent agent of change, sulfur at the same time, according to Jung, is that very component of the psyche which he says is responsible for our resistance to psychology in general. Resistance to psychology in general. The innate extraversum, I'm quoting Jung, extraversum, or turning outward of sulfur, corresponds with the place of sulfur in Japanese medical color symbolism, where yellow and red are outside, black and white inside. According to this four-color set, black is inside and cold, white inside and chill or tepid, yellow is outside and warm, red outside and hot. The transition then from white to yellow would show both as an increase in warmth and a conversion from inside to outside. And that is our clue for the relation between yellowing and sulfur. In what substance is this sulfur to be found, asks the inquirer in Sendivogius's little treatise on sulfur. The answer, in all substances, all things in the world, metals, herbs, trees, animals, stones are its ore. Outside, wherever interest is kindled, wherever the active attention turns away from itself to things, things lighting up to be consumed. The I, which we call ego, but which is itself often the sulfuric element of personality, is called forth by its counterpart, the sulfuric element in the world, which calls the soul from the chill lunar reflection of the albedo into a combustible fusion with the warm-bodied objects of desire. As things light up and catch fire, we get burned by the sulfur lurking in each thing, each tree, luring from behind every stone, like the devil, tempting out of analysis and into the body of the world. So far, we've been explicating yellow per se. Our main concern, however, is with yellowing as a transitional process in which something is yellowed. Now, what is yellowed? This something that is yellowed is the albedo, the lunar style of consciousness when the anima or soul infuses the work with its whiteness. In analysis, this whiteness, same page, next paragraph. In analysis, this whiteness refers to those feelings of positive syntonic transference, of things going easy and smooth, a gentle, sweet safety in the vessel, insights rising, synchronistic connections, resonances and echoes, the dead alive on the moon as ancestors who speak with internal voices of the activated imagination, all leading to the invulnerable conviction in the primacy of psychic reality. as another world apart from this world, life lived in psychological faith. In this lunar light of what's called the unio mentalis in alchemy, everything seems to fit. As Jung says, this is the first main goal of the process, and many alchemists were satisfied to stop here, bringing the opus to rest in peace. This condition does not want more light and more heat. Like the lyric cry of the lunatic, the lover, or the poet, it asks for asylum, sanctuary, temenos, poetic reveries, and love. One night of love, a forever lunar night that would be spoiled by dawn. Petrarch sings an anima song, "Would I were with her from the setting sun, and none saw us but the stars, one sole night, and it were never dawn. Solo una notte, e mai non fosse l'alba." Having absorbed and unified all hues into the one white, the mirror of silvered subjectivity expands to reflect all things at the expense of differentiation of itself. For it takes something outside subjectivity to see into oneself. Hence Jung's insistence on the other for individuation. But this other does not at all have to be confined to the other person in the analytical situation. Rather, the other refers to anywhere that the different appears, anything outside subjective reflection, any moment that intrudes upon white consciousness's love of its own lunar illumination, which is precisely where its blindness lies. Figulus says, "Matter, when brought to whiteness, refuses to be corrupted. The white refuses to be yellowed. It seems a spoiling. Yellowing rots the perfection achieved by urging outside the vessel to the body of the world. It is hot, smelly, earthy, male, active. Or to use an alchemical simile, the yellowing of the white is like milk becoming cheese. The white coagulates, takes on body, flavor, fatness, and the white resists this physical substantiation, for it feels like a regression to the vulgar drivenness of early moments in the work, materia prima and the nigredo, which the arduous hours of analysis have finally sophisticated and pacified. Yet, Figulus also says that whiteness remains imperfect unless it be brought to highest redness, and in fact remains dead until that occurs. Citrinatio est resuscitatio. The yellowing is a revivification or resurrection. To achieve this resuscitation, as another treatise says, the artifacts of the alchemist, the analyst, the person, the psyche, whatever, goes on increasing his fire till it assumes a yellow, then an orange or a citron color. The increasing yellow is imagined as growing within the belly of the white. What was silver on the outside was yellow on the inside. At the same time as you whiten on the outside, you yellow on the inside. The spoiling begins within. Clearly then, the yellowing is more than a spoiling of the white. It is also a brighter illumination, clarifying vision. And this clarification is particularly intellectual. Gerardus Dorn, on whom Jung relies for many insights, makes this explicit. The form, that I'm quoting Dorn now, the form, which is the intellect, is the beginning and middle and end of the procedure. And this form is made clear by the saffron color. Now this should come as no surprise, since the yellowing follows directly upon that white unio mentalis, or union in the mind. It would have to be a change in the mind, a change in the intellect. Birds play a prominent part in the symbolism of the yellowing. One writer says, the growing light of solar illumination helps one discern more clearly the imperfections of the lunar sphere. You have to reflect back on that into the discerns the imperfections of the lunar sphere. What's wrong with it? One may therefore expect a growing, though hidden, critical discernment of analyzing itself. The yellow observes whiteness, says Durola. The yellow flowers mentioned by Dorn, Chelidonia, at this juncture become a precious ingredient, says Jung, because Chelidonia cures eye disease and is particularly good for night blindness, the blindness caused by the lunar phase. When the yellowing appears, there is formed the eyewash of the philosophers. Still quoting Jung, another passage. When the yellowing appears, there is formed the collyrium or eyewash of the philosophers. Many eyes appear in the peacock's tail, and these peacock's tails are yellow, heralding a new yellow ground of seeing, where white unifies all colors into a monotheism of subjective reflection. The yellow clarification is also a dawning of many eyes, or multiple vision, or many perspectives. You see, the intellect goes through changes too, not only the heart, or the body, or the imagination. Being and thinking are the same thing, according to Plotinus, a position shared by Gnostics, by Zen teachers, by yoga teachers, as well as alchemists. Alchemy and analysis clarify the mind and sophisticate its thought, since thought derives from psyche. When you work on the psyche, you're also working on the intellect. And if the intellect doesn't change, then there's been some hampering in the psychic work. For example, the mind in the Negredo shows characteristics of downward and backward thinking, an intellect caught in reductive and depressive reasonings. What's wrong, how it got this way, what happened years ago, shrinking. Past history, shrinking to the child, of course. Past history, materialized fantasies, and concretistic explanations. The Negredo psyche knows itself as victimized, traumatized, dependent, and limited by circumstantiality and substantiality. The Negredo psyche is eo ipso substance abused. The mind in Albedo more likely dreams, receptive, impressionable, imagistic, self-reflective, and perhaps comfortably magical. This state of whiteness does not live. It is a sort of abstract ideal state, says Jung. This state of whiteness does not live. It is sort of abstract ideal state, says Jung. Now, Dorn's account doesn't enough describe the nature of the yellowed intellect. It's not the continued expansion of white consciousness, a kind of increase of reflective capacity. It's more than just aware or more than enlightened. It must be hot and male, beginning with the light yellow or dirty brown of Mars, and even putrid if it is to spring the mirrored prism of reflection. Since sulfur, with all its corruption and intensity and feculence, has been instrumental in the change, this mind burns with its own bitter bile, the yellow choler. The yellowing phase in Senior, another alchemist, is expressed by an arch of armed eagles, which adds yet another image to the cutting swords, splitting arrows, cleaving serpents, and piercing rays of the yellowing. You see how violent it is. Brighter, more coagulated, and more combustible, the yellowed intellect is complicated with emotions, as one is indeed aware and alive intensely in jealousy, in cowardice, fear, prejudice, aging, and decay. No longer just mirroring the mind responsive to what's happening, watching it go by, The mind becomes like a smoldering yellow effusion, staining with intellectual passion whatever it meets. The yellowness of the sulfur, says Hopkins, has brought out all the hidden yellow of the metal and changed it into a kind of gold in which yellow was abundant and overflowing. Now, this is not the usual intellect, dried with concepts, academic, abstracted, theoretical. This is the fat intellect, physical, concrete, emotional, fermenting with instinctual intention, an unctuous passion. Having first been whitened, its desire is not simple and driven, but desire aware of itself through intellectual fervor. Dorn's form, an intellectus agens. And no longer is there that separation between mercury and sulfur, between fantasy flights and dense emotional body, between quick wit and choked anger. In the carcass of the lion, there's a new sweetness, thick and yellow, and sticking to all things like honey, like oil, flowing like wax. And so the citrinitas leads to the reddening. And those images of honey and lion and oil and wax all come from descriptions surrounding the yellowing. Let's go to page 16. Turning now to a case for further amplification and using alchemy as a grid for conceiving the psychology of analysis. Now, before I do that, what's the time, Gusti? We're turning now to a case for further amplification and using alchemy as a grid for conceiving the psychology of analysis. And by doing this, I confess myself a Jungian, that is, by using alchemy as a grid. I confess myself a Jungian rather than of another school that relies on other basic metaphors such as infancy, typology, chronological development, or developmental psychology, or diagnoses and transference. In other words, I take Jung seriously, even literalistically, when he claims that alchemical metaphors best provide understanding for what the psyche goes through in deep, long-term analysis. I also confess myself a Jungian by introducing the case not as empirical base or evidence, but as a further amplification of the metaphors and figures. Jung says, instead of deriving these figures from our psychic conditions, we must derive our psychic conditions from these figures. That was my little lesson. The patient now, a woman in her 40s, professional, married, though not closely, childless, intensely introverted, yet adapted. After a second bout of analysis lasting 2 years, she was required to return to her home country on a fixed date, force majeure. Although she often had dreamt of colors, at this juncture, with the departure date very firm in our calendars, her dreams began to yellow, as follows and in brief. January 18th, a cat dozing on and off, yellow and white stripes on the cat. January 20th, yellow cloth with letters on it. January 24th, white lustrous letters. January 24th, yellow legal-sized notepads. January 27th, I remember I had a baby. Baby is wrapped in a yellow robe. January 27th, a yellow book open to where it says, End Chapter 1, Beginning Chapter 2. January 28th, big eye on the wall. I looking through a hole in a curtain. I said the word origin in English. You know, origin is related to orire, to arise, from which orient, east, sunrise, dawn, so on. February 1st, big rooster, black, but some part had a different color. February 1st, it became daylight. Later in February, bright light, even with eye shades or dark glasses on. Now you will have noticed in these, you will have noticed themes in this material corresponding with the yellowing. Alternating yellow and white in the striped cats dozing on and off. The logos clarifications in letters, words, and books. Eyesight, awakening, daylight, dawn, new life. The yellowing of her dreams also corresponds with the phase of the analysis itself, ending to return to her obligations in the world. Hers had been a very white analysis. 2 or 3 times a week, many dreams, each session which she worked on assiduously, hours of solitude, reading, reflection, reverie, imagination, memory, nature, sort of Zurich-style analysis, at least as it once was. Few relationships, eating alone, isolation owing to language difficulties, feelings and fantasies focused on the analysis and me, the analyst. Now she was planning her work for the next months at home, arranging schedules, letters and phone calls, parting ceremonies, shopping, and imagining further activities, dancing, cooking, friends, and translating. She suggested translating one of my books into her language. Then we found a white interpretation for this suggestion. We understood translation as a way of remaining inside the vessel by maintaining the relationship, abstract and distanced as exigencies had decreed. Since then, I see that this turn to words in her dreams and plans accords with the yellowing, not only as solar clarification described in the 9th key of the Golden Tripod, where there's a sentence where they present all the planets and all the metals and everything in a long procession, and grammar carries a yellow banner. So all that, those words and books and letters and legal pads are part of the yellow banner of grammar, language, the order of language. And that precedes the sun in the parade of planets and the virtues and arts associated with them. Going back to Dorn's emphasis on the activation of intellect during the yellowing, it seems to be borne out in this case. So now, however, I have a more yellowed and sulfuric interpretation for her suggestion to translate. It didn't merely represent a backward move to retain the transference. It was also a move outward into publication, a multiplicatio and projectio, her embodied mind entering the world. Besides, isn't translation a copulation, a meeting of tongues in linguistic intercourse? Perhaps I have not made clear that her yellowing differs from another sort I have seen. Just as all whites are not the albedo, since the primary material can be candida rather than albus, that is, white as innocence rather than white as reflection. As there are 2 Roman words for white, there are 2 kinds of white. White at the beginning when it's innocence, the stupidity of innocence, and then white as reflective albedo. So there is sometimes a primitive yellow or orange or of raw and burning activity, a pleasure principle of id fire, the uncooked sulfur of manic brightness. This appears in dreams as a boy with orange hair or a yellow t-shirt, a bright yellow car going like mad, a lion escaped, or a yellow dog. These examples of sulfuric intensity do not result from white as interior to it, like butter from milk, but require whitening the yellow as anterior to it, something that comes first. Again, colors have no single meaning. They must be placed within an image, a mood, a time, and a context. Back to her. Despite the preparations for departure, the yellowing was mainly internal, where Fabricius says, or his term, yellow death, was taking place. What he says, a melancholia and consolation. Both over the ending of analysis, symbolic with aging and ending of life, life fallen into the sear, the yellow leaf, as Macbeth says, herself no longer the girl, her safety in whiteness no longer assured. She couldn't retreat to the harbor of innocence. How would her husband react when she got back? There occurred fear of losing what had happened, jealousy over others who did not have to leave, smoldering anger over what was not accomplished, that is, what was not fulfilled concretely in the martial urges toward me. Remember this phrase from Philalethes: yellow is a true sign of copulation of our man and woman together. Sometimes a bitter look, a curled lip, a lapse into suppressive silence. A killing was also going on. Looking back, I ask, where was the smelly, oily, fat sulfur that brings richness, lightness, joy to the stone, and the capacity for this wax stone to float along? I remember feeling that an underlying depression had not at all lifted and an acidic bitterness had not at all sweetened. I was myself then disconsolate by what I felt then had cut short the work. Our rapport had become complicated. She seemed suddenly so dense. By the increasing presence of these indelible emotions that seemed bent on destroying the harmony and illuminating insights that nevertheless still kept coming. Then I rationalized these perceptions by attending mainly to what we were achieving. Today, looking back through my yellow-tinted lens, I believe that what was also being achieved, besides the yellow illumination, was actually a thorough spoiling of the white harmony which her emotions and my perceptions were clearly indicating. A spoiling which my own analytical whiteness resisted and tried to smooth over. I felt something going wrong, but I took it literally and was afraid, not recognizing that the spoiling and the fear and cowardice, too, were appropriately part of the same yellow light, the yellow light that hinders perfection. We're in the last section. Jung said alchemy has two aims: the rescue of the human soul, the salvation of the cosmos. Yellowing rescues the soul from the whiteness of psychological reflection and insight. For to repeat what Jung said, in this state of whiteness one does not live. In order to come alive, it must have blood, the rubedo, the redness of life. Then the opus magnum is finished. That's Jung. I understand this rescue operation to apply to psychology itself. And let me explain. As the alchemical opus rescues the soul of the individual, so the opus can rescue the psyche of psychology, conceived only in terms of the individual human. From the alchemical perspective, the human individual may be a necessary but cannot be sufficient focus. The rescue of the cosmos is equally important. Neither can take place without the other. Soul and world are inseparable, anima mundi. It is precisely this fact that the yellowing makes apparent and restores, a fact which the white state of mind cannot recognize because that mind has unified into itself the world, all things psychologized. Take the world as a dream, they say. taking the world into the psyche, looking at the world from the moon. If psychological practice neglects its yellowing, it can never leave off psychologizing and never redden into the world out there and never be alive to the cosmos, from which today come our actual psychological disorders. Remember, sulfur is found in all things and out there. All things and out there. Yellow turns outward. The inwardness habit of psychologizing follows consequently from the albedo condition, which, as an undivided purity, loses distinctions. Therefore, the albedo seeks clarifications of the disturbing, yellowing emotions of transference and countertransference by means of white psychological inspections. Yet each new speculative refinement, object relations theory, Kohut, Lange's, Lacan, continues to polish further the albedo mirror so that we may see more clearly. But what we see is still the human face, and what we still hear is human language. Getting out there requires the yellow death, that poisoning iosis, prepared by a putrefaction of the mental union that is analytical consciousness. This poisoning, and the iosis was the word for the purpling or reddening, and it also means poisoning, countertransference, which intensify the mirror's gleam to the world's neglect. The analyst, too, is yellowed. He cannot escape the opus, since the artifex is himself the material worked on. He therefore feels a fermenting discomfort of interior doubt, that yellowing inside the white which treacherously observes it from within. We feel ourselves betraying what we were, the realizations we believed, our very psychological faith and its achievements, even our former pain and the scars of identity which that pain gave us. For pain too changes color, as the negredo has its inconsolable wounds that then lift into the whitened suffering of aesthetic sensitivity. So the yellow brings the pain of knowledge, the eagles and arrows of seeing sharp and true, together with the fire and fear of seeing destructively, the cowardice, jealousy, choler, rage, and decay that taints both the work and the worker. To evade the death by yellowing, going straight from soul to world, is not what alchemy recommends. The texts warn against the reddening coming too fast, warn against direct flame, warn that if a red oil floats on the surface, the work has been spoiled. Without the yellow, the whitened mind converts directly to red, enantiodromia, moving straight forward by converting psychic insights into literal programs. We reflect the world in the mirror, then, of psychology, reducing the conflicts of the world to shadow projections, the exploitation of the earth to body problems, the destruction of nature to repression of our interior unconscious wilderness. And we get into a room and work on it. We prescribe more of the feminine, more anima, more lunar consciousness, though the yellowing is a time of Mars, where, as one alchemist writes, the male is on top of the female. We believe magically that self-transformation trickles down and multiplies or projects into the world. If you work enough on yourself, it will eventually affect the world. We've been doing that for the last 100 years, and the world has got steadily messier. We psychologize the world instead of mundifying the psyche. We psychologize the world by albedo means of conceptual, psychological reflection, whereas a yellowed psyche heralds the rainbow rather than the moon, and a psychology that is sensate, aesthetic, embodied, a psychology which resists psychology. Remember, that was the phrase that Jung said. It is the sulfur which resists psychology and hinders its perfection. Yet alchemy itself tempts away from the yellow, which gives an inherent reason for its eventual neglect and our urge to jump over it. Because the last operations are so extroverted, the heat of the spirit so high, the king constellated in the rubedo, there is an exalted mission to multiply psychic projects in the world. Go forth and multiply. Mercurius multiflores tempts us into the world of sense, says Jung. And his habitation, says Jung, is in the veins swollen with blood. This blood, identified in the secular unconscious with the redemptive and missionary blood of Christ, urges ever forward to spread by conversion of the heathen. We need more psychology in the world. Our large-scale Jungian film showings, summer institutes, public events, even our training programs may be driven by sudden reddening, may also account for the resistance by classic Jungians to going public, and by attempts to slow training by increased hours of analysis. No wonder we are sometimes seen as latter-day Rosicrucians. We began this morning by recalling that the yellowing phase faded from the alchemical schema after the 16th century, which is precisely when alchemy itself began to fade, partly into the Rosicrucian movement, or coagulating into either mountebank gold-making for temporal princes, or into spiritual directions for esoteric Christian redemption, or into experimental physical science. Can we not draw a lesson from history? If the practice of Jungian psychology continues the alchemical tradition, then we too, unless we fully yellow, simply repeat its fate, falling prey to either physical scientism, spiritual esotericism, or the business of professionalism as princes of this world, or all three mixed. Yellow, as a third, functions less as a synthesis than as a transcendent disintegration, thus preventing the reddening of coming too straight, too fast, too sublime, too perfect, the red cross, the red rose, the red blood of mission and salvation. Our work, for it to approach its cosmic purpose, which, as Jung says, is part of our work, for it to reach the world, it must spoil itself. The withering away of the state, said Marx, displacing the subject by deconstructing its own consciousness, said Derrida, self-destruct as damage control, kill the Buddha, apocalyptic via negativa, catastrophe theory, Shevirath ha-kelim, breaking the vessels. If we wash our vision in the yellow collyrium, we would be able to observe the whiteness of psychology with a fully jaundiced eye. We might then recognize that the issues plaguing psychology, sexual copulation, ethical rules, lawsuits, insurance payments, licensing laws, training regulations, regional and international organizations, expose the fermenting corruption breaking the white psyche out of its self-enclosure, which it defends by intensely, narcissistically focusing upon countertransference, training supervision, childhood, and the self. I'm going to read that one again. We might then recognize that the issues plaguing psychology, sexual copulation, ethical rules, lawsuits, insurance payments, licensing laws, training regulations, regional and international organizations, expose the fermenting corruption breaking the white psyche out of its self-enclosure, which it defends by intensely, narcissistically focusing upon countertransference, training supervision, childhood, and the self. The fermenting corruptions which seem diversions from the main job of therapy may actually be how the psyche is yellowing into the cosmos. If so, there will be more psychology actually going on and more soul actually to be made in the ferment of these corruptions than in the enlightened discussions of cases and theories. The esoteric is always in the outcast area. Today, the stone we builders reject is our building of psychology itself. Furthermore, those patients who turn on us, turn on analysis, who condemn and sue and expose and violate the trust, may actually be angels of the yellow road to the Emerald City. Angels in the salvation of the cosmos from the psyche closed long enough into individualism. Sulfuric angels pointing the way at the end of this analytic century to an end of analysis that omits the world. What I hope to do this morning, I feel, is done, to disclose the yellow light within a process we ourselves are in, and to leave on it an indelible yellow stain. But finally this: inasmuch as every objective exposition is also a subjective confession, and inasmuch as I said this morning that thought derives from psyche, let me bear empirical witness to these assumptions and to the yellowing in my own case. I have in part been yellowed, and like Albrecht Dürer's self-portrait, I point to my own gelb fleck. 9 months ago, I ceased practicing private analysis. I continue to practice psychology here, and with large groups, and in public speaking, and in teaching, and wherever it occurs, and in writing and publishing. And these activities are permeated with the same sulfuric fumes that have characterized this paper and others corrosive to the white psychology which other parts of me have very long championed. In the white mirror, I see myself as having simply walked out and closed the door on the consulting room of transference entanglements, too yellow-bellied and too withering in age to refine my skills further. So instead, I am acting out my countertransference on analysis itself. Globally, and with the destructive vision of prophetic inflation, convinced that what takes place in the depths of one's soul is taking place as well in other souls, in the cosmic anima mundi. I attribute this conviction to a predominance of sulfur in its conjunction with Mercury. And what else to say, save that for me, the white moon is down, even if the red sun is not risen, and my choler not sanguine. Thank you.
I found that the only way I could deliver this response was to speak directly to James Hillman, to tutoyer, as it were. Jim, I was thinking that at the time you give up conventional analytical practice, you find the words to clarify the analytical attitude. Not wanting, not even hoping, not clean but sullied, not focused on things going well but on things that stink, not against thought but aware that what the analyst thinks affects what he or she does. You point out the greed attached to an exclusively interior perspective, and you expose our attempts to resolve our profession's inferiority complex whether by a moralistic demand for a so-called religious attitude to the psyche, or by a mechanistic demand for so-called here and now transference interpretation. Turning now to your case material, I was interested in your experience of what, coming from my tradition, I call countertransference. You described yourself as disconsolate, sensing her as dense and the relationship as complicated. Could it be that you were also embodying her depressive despair, both at losing you and ending the analysis, and also her depressive guilt at the killing that you quite rightly point out was going on? If this is so, then your countertransference at the time was already plugged in imaginally to that yellowing, long before your later conscious realization. For two persons, analyst and analysand, are in a relationship wherein it is possible for the experiences of the one to be relevant for the other. Not only because of projective identifications, which assume a gap of empty space between the two, but also because within the analytical container, both people acquire access to the mundus imaginalis. They are both contained in the same imagery, both nourished by the same rhizome. The analytical relationship in and of itself has archetypal properties and archetypal dynamics. And paradoxically, these impersonal qualities and properties come to life just because there are two ordinary persons present. The personal and the impersonal facilitate each other. This mention of the persons present in analysis leads to the following remarks. I think that there is a spectre haunting and stalking your work just now, Jim, threatening to subvert it. That spectre is the human subject, le sujet. Your psychology has now to deal with the return of the human subject, making his or her claim for ontological priority, prior to body, prior to society, prior to word, prior to image. All these somehow depend on the human subject. Now, most, if not all Jungians, would agree with you that the soul has inhuman reaches, and that there's more to psychology than the individual human being. But the human subject who appears in your work and in this paper today, only to be dismissed from it, isn't the human subject at all, only a distortion of the human subject. You seem to equate the human subject with sentimental, humanistic, ahistorical trumpeting of the supremacy of the so-called individual, leading among analysts to the elevation of the patient or analysand in a myopic clinical triumphalism. But this unthinking and reactionary version does not grasp the nature of le sujet. The human subject who is waiting in the wings is not like that. Not white at all. Not a romantic cliché. Not a humanistic ideal. Not the unified being of orthodox psychology. Not Jungian self nor Freudian ego. Did that pristine creature, which both of us, you and I, have attacked, ever exist? Or was it perhaps part of our transference onto analysis? No. The subject who is returning to the culture is indeed already a yellowed subject, characterized by lack, somewhat faded as well as jaded, jerky, marginalized, alienated, split, guilty, empty, imaginary. Post-Klein, post-Lacan, yes, and post-Hillman too, we recognize this anti-heroic, yellowed, plural human subject. If we don't count this human subject in, then all the rest, soul, world, cosmos, won't be in our psychology either. What shall we do with this de-idealized, decayed, putrefied, violent, and marvelously rebellious human subject? This is the crunch point. The yellowed human subject is the means to mundify the psyche, not the obstacle to it. The means, not the obstacle. The yellowing in which you are interested turns out to be coterminous with the human subject in whom you're not. The human subject doesn't require what you call a counterpart in the world. He or she makes and is made by that world in a ceaseless, generative struggle. As they discovered here in this city in the year 1789, but had lost sight of by 1792, we can change the world that is changing us. We can change the world that is changing us. Just as the state has not withered away, so le sujet has not been deconstructed out of sight. Le sujet is where we find discriminations and conjunctions and bridges, inner and outer, physical and mental, body and soul, mind and spirit, world and psyche. The human subject is Agent Yellow. So for me, this is where reacting to your latest courageous and confessional work has led. The reinvention of the human subject. And maybe now, for the first time in 100 years of our strange profession, archetypal psychology and human psychology could become the same thing. I'll move on now to discuss alchemy and something you say about it that is directly relevant to the theme of our Congress. And here I need to read out a sentence from your paper, Jim, because you abbreviated a little bit when you read it out, and it's the starting point for what I have to say next. I confess myself a Jungian rather than of another school that relies on other basic metaphors such as infancy, typology, chronological development, mythical gods, diagnoses, transference, etc. You confess yourself a Jungian in your usage of the alchemical metaphor for analysis, and you mention and dismiss other metaphors such as infancy or the gods. Now, I would not say that it is possible for an analyst to feel equally at home with alchemy, infancy, and the gods. But it may be possible to feel unequally at home with all of these metaphors for analysis. Does locating oneself within a single metaphor mean that the only possible attitude towards the others is ignorance shading into contempt? It is very seductive to argue, first, that these metaphors are radically different from each other, and second, that only a single metaphor in which the analyst has passionate conviction or faith will do the trick. Do these two arguments hold up? The problem is to find an approach, a vision, a form of words which respects the deep and specific differences between the metaphors, while at exactly the same time apperceiving them as linked. After all, the different metaphors do the same almost impossible job of tracking the typical psychological movements of an analysis. Incidentally, citing infancy as a metaphor is in itself an important statement, and I think one with which many developmentally oriented analysts agree. I believe that it helps us here to turn to William James and to the idea of pluralism. Pluralism isn't the same as multiplicity or the many. Rather, it is a study of how the one and the many interact. James says that each part of the world is in some ways connected and in other ways not connected with the other parts. And the key word is some. As James says, pluralism stands for the legitimacy of the notion of some. Alchemy, infancy, the gods are different metaphors, but they are connected in some ways. If we could agree that there are some connections between these various warring metaphors for analysis, then we can start to see what kind of a dialogue might take place between them, or see what kind of dialogue is already going on. For Jim, in this paper, as in much of your writing, you are in an implicit dialogue or interview with something or somebody you have yourself created. A pluralistic dialogue isn't quite so solipsistic. It is full of competitive aggression and tricksterish bargaining, full of power struggles as each analyst or group of analysts strives to annihilate the other. But the warring analysts and the warring metaphors cannot simply shake off their contact with each other. The opponent, like the human subject, won't just go away. Annihilation is a delusion. The omnipresence and integrity of one's opponent, resisting the false ways in which we all, not just you, we all try to describe him or her, is what yellows the dialogue. Sure, you can describe the opponent as narcissistic, transference-bound, religios, but he or she will bounce back, rejecting that distortion and returning to the argument. La luta continua. Like it or not, the dialogue and confrontation go on, as they always have in depth psychology. And amidst the seemingly ridiculous institutional splits, a kind of exchange is constantly being crafted. I think that this exchange, and let us recall that Hermes is the god of trade, this exchange has reached the point where we have to look yet again at what is meant by Jungian analysis. My view is that already for quite some time, Jungian analysis has been pluralistic, employing many diverse metaphors such as alchemy, infancy, and the gods, but remaining one discernible enterprise. But our thinking may not have caught up with what we do or can do. Yellowing, as you depict it, is a part of Jungian analysis. So too is object relations. So too are Aphrodite, Hermes, and the others. If a Jungian analyst seeks to place so-called Jungian analysis and so-called object relations in eternal opposition, then our history is passing him or her by. What I've called the schools of analytical psychology are themselves metaphors, for they are also within each of us, within each single Jungian analyst. Your recognition of your patient's personal transference to you shows that you too are in the SAP, or more exactly, that the SAP is in you. I hope you don't hear me as arbitrating between the metaphors or as advocating synthesis or eclecticism. Nor is this a dry perspective. Passion abides in dialogue and tolerance as much as it does in monologue and fanaticism. I'm saying that the differing metaphors for analysis are simultaneously diverse and in some way part of a unified phenomenon called analytical psychology. A whole set of monotheistic, integrative, and elitist concerns is talking with a whole set of polytheistic, interactive, and democratic concerns. Analytical psychology has become plurivocal. I'd like to end by saying that I agree completely that it is gross inflation to use the insights of the consulting room as if they were recipes for curing the world. It can also be embarrassing, to say the least, this panpsychism in Jung's phrase. And we shall have to look at some of the consequences of it in Jung's thought in the workshop on anti-Semitism tomorrow and Friday. Yes, I agree. The individual analysand and the world are different spheres of experience. But with a further nod to William James, they do have some features in common. And it's up to us to find out what those features are. What worries me is that we'll cheer your paper to the echo because it strikes a guilty chord in us and offers a clear-cut solution. But we won't change what we do at all. I wonder, does being an analyst in one way rule out being an analyst in another way? Wouldn't that be too monotheistic a ruling? I think it is possible to dwell and to work in psyche and city in a spirit of animated moderation. Thank you.
There's so many different things, but the business of the last word, Andrew, of moderation, you know, we've known each other long enough to know that I never have anything to do with moderation. and that moderation tends to become a balanced, mediocre, overall view of bringing things together. You say several times you don't want to be eclectic and you don't want to do a synthesis, but there is that, just as I tend to get, Marshall and go that way, you tend to get Jupiterian and get an overview. And that includes everything somehow in your overview, and then the real problem is lost. The burn is lost. And I'm trying to stay with the burn, because the burn is not just a shadow echo in all of us. It is an essential problem of the end of this century, that analysis that's been going on for 100 years with a certain delusion, I believe by now, that it is the cure of the world, seems to me to contribute to its problem by removing the most intelligent, sensitive people from the world into the consulting room, and the world gets, it's too much to deal with in 6.5 minutes.
Sure. And what I'm saying is that provided one doesn't distort what one might mean by the human subject or the human being in a way that is convenient to one, provided one doesn't do that, then a whole new intuitive possibility opens up. And this is what came to me reacting to your paper, which is that the human subject that we are faced with is already doing something of the job that you want. It's a question of recognizing it. First of all, to describe it, and then to recognize it. And for me, the key element in what I'm saying, and it picks up on the questioner from out there who I didn't locate, what he was saying, is that if we really want to engage in some kind of polis, in some kind of social, political way, then let's not ignore what the human being stands for in relation to the psyche-world connection. The human being, provided we don't set him up only to knock him down as some kind of ridiculous piece of psychological theory, a kind of abstraction which is so easy to distort and to destroy, provided we don't do that, I think the human being...
I thought that the room was to be given a chance to speak now.
Yes.
Hillman.
Mr. Hillman, the presentation. It's the first presentation on the psychology of colors which we'd heard. It's the first time that I hear a level which I would call scientific. A psychology of colors which seems more developed, which, if only because it is so in-depth and serious and escapes the criticism of alchemism, which is far too often heard in the other schools. And I would like to thank the French interpreters for their brilliance in translating such a difficult concept in its connotations and cultural annotations. And I must say that I regret that Mr. Hillman did not use the word torrid about sulfur, and this torrid was brought to Mr. Samuel's mind. And I would like to point out that in Japan, you become a master chef, a cook, when you're able to have a upside down, a sunny side down, an opposite egg. The Japanese master chef puts the white in the inside and the yolk on the outside to have an ideal egg which goes against the grain of nature. I'm sorry that Mr. Hillman did not sufficiently discuss relations between sulfur, iron, and copper. The sulfur, which is everywhere and nowhere, and constantly opposes the iron of blood and the copper of sap. But nonetheless, I would like to thank him for having recalled us the importance of dreams in color and colors in dreams, which are practically never discussed. I noticed his maestria in the metaphor. Mr. Samuel uses it, the verbal metaphor, where he insists on the Trinitas that came after Paternitas, which included the C Trinitas. You didn't even mention this. And I'm also sorry that you did not mention white, basic white, as the color of mourning, that one has forgotten the French culture through Percival, and I don't see why we poison ourselves instead of discussing a paper of basic importance. Thank you very much.
Discussion vote. One more discussion vote.
I would have another question to Mr. Hillman. What about the stage of the... I'm here. The stage of the green lion, grüner Löwe, devouring the sun. You know, the Citrinitas, the yellowing, is not the last stage of the opus. And after this comes the rubedo, which starts with the image of this green lion devouring the sun. For me, the yellowing stage is the working from very archetypal images and forces, and the green line marks the point from integration of these forces and to accept that the archetypal forces are working through us, but too we are working. Yeah? And you know, on the last woodcuts of the Rosarium, there are human beings returned. Yeah? Maybe this is the return of the human subject from which Mr. Samuels had spoken. Mm-hmm. Yeah? And maybe there are some more informations in this alchemic opus than we hear now.
The Green Lion operation has mainly to do, as I understand it, with working on the sulfur. And the various interpretations, it's such a big thing, but what I sense in your response is, again, the return to the human subject, and as if we integrate the archetypal forces, which to me sounds like the return of the green lion, the great, giant, ravenous mouth of our Western ego that wants to take it all back inside. And I'm trying to get out of that metaphor, that entire subjectivist view. That's all I can say. I'm trying to get out of that subjectivist view.
Well, thank you very much, and by this I close the session.